From the Folger Shakespeare Library, this is Shakespeare Unlimited. I'm Farah Kareem Cooper, the Folger director. Many of the programs and scholarship at the Folger focus, of course, on Shakespeare and his world. But our research library contains hundreds of thousands of books, manuscripts, maps, posters, playbills, and lots of other rare materials. Researchers working in many fields other than Shakespeare studies find our collections useful. So today, we're going to take a little detour from our usual subject matter. We're going to hear from Patricia A. Matthew, an associate professor of English at Montclair State University in New Jersey, teaching British literature. Matthew recently completed a fellowship at the Folger, studying colonial sugar plantations in the Caribbean. That research helped inform her new editions of Jane Austen's novels, Pride and Prejudice, Northanger Abbey, and Mansfield Park. Here's Patricia Matthew in conversation with Barbara Bogave.
Well, you wrote a piece in The Atlantic in 2017 called On Teaching But Not Loving Jane Austen. So how is it that we're here now talking about her? And what did you not love about her?
Yeah, I think that there's not a delicate way to say this.
Go
I
right
think
ahead.
it's not.
It's not a delicate podcast.
Yeah, Austen is fine. She's a great writer. She tells wonderful stories. She knows her milieu. She represents it and recreates it in really amazing ways. It can be tricky to be in the Austen world with scholars, critics, and fans who are deeply attached to their understanding of her. And I think that what that piece was about underneath that, it wasn't that I didn't love Austen. I didn't love that she had become the novelist of that period. Right, so the piece begins with me sort of joking that I was cranky, that people didn't pay attention to Mary Shelley because she had also written, I think, 6 novels, but everyone pays attention to Austen. And I was really interested in what I called underread women novelists of the time. And there were also scholars who were thinking about those artists and those novelists, but really the narrative around Austen that we, and I have to include myself in that, created was what I know now that I was pushing back against. And I think that because she's a woman writer and women writers are so easily dismissed, and the things that women are interested in are often dismissed, it's all too easy to focus on her as a cultural warrior without thinking about what she offers or doesn't offer, the questions she asks or doesn't ask in her work, because we're so interested in the hagiography and kind of holding her up as a person that we admire. And it's really hard then to say, but what is she doing here that might not be quote unquote admirable? That doesn't make her a less brilliant writer, but maybe someone that we need to sort of step back and understand in a fuller range.
And that's what you did, and this whole not loving Jane Austen path brought you to the Folger on a fellowship focused on researching the origins of English wealth in New World sugar plantations and the slave trade, because that's the wealth that underpins all of the wealthy people in her novels. So what materials were you interested in the archives there?
So I started out wanting to learn more about the way that Jamaica is represented in all kinds of texts and documents. So the Folger has books, the Laws of Jamaica, written by the Privy Council, or representations of Jamaica in encyclopedic text that account for all of the different kinds of flora and fauna of the Caribbean. That was the main focus that I went in with. My book looks at 18th and 19th century literature and literary and visual culture. It compares that to contemporary Black representations of that iconography, and then how Jamaica is represented in texts that would have circulated in England in the 18th and 19th century.
So say even in travelogues, which I know the Folger has a lot of.
Yes, exactly. Travelogues, plays, poems. I was also interested I have a chapter on portraiture, and there's a painting that I was wanting to understand more carefully that has a man who looks very much like Ira Aldridge standing next to a young white woman. I saw that in Bristol in England. And so I wanted to understand how Ira Aldridge looks and how he looks shifts and changes depending on the objects he's depicted in. So he's different in an engraving than he is in an advertisement, and he is in a frontispiece where he's playing Othello. And then along the way, I knew that I was interested in mapping and cartography. The John Carter Brown Library purchased a plan of a plantation map in Jamaica that was owned by the godfather of Austen's brother. And the key to the map shows how the land is allotted. So there are this many acres and they are for grazing. And then there are this many acres and they're for growing different crops. And then there are plots of land that are assigned with names of enslaved people. And those are plots of land that were assigned to enslaved people to grow food for themselves and also for the plantation. And it's really rare to have a map that says this plot of land is assigned to this person. And so I went to the John Carter Brown Library and was able to see it and think about it. And I wanted to understand that plantation plan in the context of other kinds of cartography, maps of Jamaica, representations of Jamaican plantations that are really sanitized and used to circulate the propagandic idea that slavery didn't need to be abolished because it had been ameliorated by less cruel models of life. And what I found at the Folger, in not all, but often I would be looking at a travel log, or I might be looking at a book like The Laws of Jamaica, and then folded into the pages, almost like origami, were maps. And I was fascinated by them. And then I started, and this is the glory, by the way, of being a long-term fellow, I just had time to sort of do a kind of rabbit hole, except you're in an archive. You're not on the internet going down a rabbit hole. I started pulling and asking and looking for different kinds of maps, and then thinking about the way that plots of land are described before we get to a plantation map. And so that was what I spent mostly the last half of my fellowship. Like, why is it significant that we have a person's name? And how are Black people, are enslaved people represented on other kinds of maps? And so there's a Jamaica map or things that say like Negro Valley or Mulatto River, and trying to understand how those things speak to one another was part of my project there.
Wow. First of all, thanks for that window into what it's like to do this kind of work in an archive like the Folger. And also, so you'd request a book out of the vault and a map would just fall out of it? That must have been an amazing experience.
Yes, because, I'm reading, and there's some of it's rather dry and some of it's very depressing.
Sure.
And then you just see this piece of paper and one map. I started to unfold it and became clear that it was much bigger than it looked. And one of the conservationists actually had to come out and unfold, pull it out for me because the paper was so fragile. It was massive. I can't believe that they were able to fold it in so many ways so that it stuck in a book that's not particularly big. And so then I started, in every book, I started reading the descriptions on the catalog a little more carefully. And like, oh, if it says map, I want to see where the map is. And then comparing different maps in different books. And every time I would open a book, I was looking, before I would even open it, I would look to see if there were pages that were a little bit thicker, because that would suggest that there was something folded into the book, and it would probably be a map.
Oh, such exciting detective work. Okay, so you used Austen as a way into the study of Britain's abolitionist movement and the history of slavery. But getting back to Austen, did this kind of research change your understanding of her work or her place in the canon?
Yeah, there are novels where she's very explicit. Mansfield Park, the title ask you to think about Lord Mansfield, who's a figure that looms large in abolitionist politics, for example.
Right. And readers, of course, now don't know that Lord Mansfield was someone who passed laws about the slave trade, but anyone reading back then would know exactly what Jane Austen was alluding to.
Right, exactly. And, Sir Thomas has a plantation in the West Indies in Antigua. So that seems like a really explicit connection, and you ask those questions. And so for me, the challenge is, what do I do and how do I think about Austen in novels where that's not explicitly stated? So I think particularly, for example, like Pride and Prejudice, that whole novel exists in a world that never once nods to the fact that a lot of the wealth, most of the wealth, I can say, that makes that world possible is based on the enslavement of people of color, Black people, Native Americans. She never talks about it. She doesn't really talk about it in Northanger Abbey, even though one of the novelists that she references in Northanger Abbey also wrote about plantation life in the Caribbean. And so I feel like more than Austen in the canon for me, it's more how do I think about Austen and not replicate the cordoning off of certain novels because those questions aren't as explicit. And that's often the expectation. So people who know me, I'm editing an edition of Mansfield Park for Norton Classics. And everyone who knows, like, yes, that's Patricia's novel to edit, right? It's all right there on the surface. How do I think about that for Pride and Prejudice? And I was not nervous about the history, but I really wanted readers to understand that we can't just pretend that it happens or it's in one novel. It's just not excavated in every novel. And so I wanted for people to understand that this is what you need to understand about Austen, the writer, regardless of what is explicit in the text. And I didn't want it to be a footnote. I didn't want to treat it as if it were something that was an exceptional way to think about Austen. People actually think about Austen politically all the time. They understand that the French Revolution happened, for example. They understand that as a woman writer, she was making political statements and actually being a woman who told stories. But race and slavery is something different, and I think people have really wanted to keep her apart from that.
I'm thinking also, anybody listening to this is thinking of Shonda Rhimes and her television series, Bridgerton, and the other ones. How did they fit into this project of reframing Austen's work?
Well, my first job is to tell people that Bridgerton is not an Austen adaptation. And even people who you think would know better, I remember being interviewed and they were like, well, it's, this is an Austen adaptation. I'm like, I promise you it's not. I think it's clear that the novelist who wrote Bridgerton, I want to say Julia Quinn, that's her name. It's clear that she read Austen and she's in the Regency period. But
well, people lump them all together, right?
People lump them all together.
Yeah.
In much the same way that I think to a lot of people, if you say that you study 19th century novels, they say, oh, Jane Austen and the Brontes. And those are different writers
Completely
writing in a different
yeah.
England, right? The Victorian England is very different from Regency England. But we kind of paint over all of that. And I think that the world that Shonda Rhimes, I wouldn't say she replicates, that she gestures towards, reminds people of what they think they know or imagine about Regency-era culture. Everyone in the original novels is white. Shonda Rhimes added people of color. Quinn does not. It's a sparkling white world. And what was interesting to me is that when Shonda Rhimes introduces people of color into a world, even though she insists in almost every case, they're either aristocrats or upwardly mobile, which is, I think, Shonda Rhimes' real milieu. It really makes us think, well, what were Black people? Like, were there Black people in England, and what were their lives like? And I think it invites us to go back and look at what the world might have actually been like. I think that Austen fans in particular are fascinating because they actually really want to understand the history. They want to understand the cultural moment that produced these novels. And I think Rhimes invites us to go back and look at that world more closely.
So what I hear you saying is that Bridgerton, almost despite itself, helps to change the conversation around race and Regency culture.
Yes, exactly. Queen Charlotte is a spin-off of Bridgerton, and I thought it was the most interesting one. So one of the threads of Queen Charlotte is that the queen mother understands that she's about to bring a woman of color into England. And so she makes all of these other people of color aristocrats. It's like it's the first DEI project in history. We need more people of color with titles. And so it doesn't work that way. And that's not what happened. And Shonda Rhimes tells us this at the beginning, this is a story, it's not history. But I thought, wow, that's a kind of fascinating question that forces us, or pulls us in, I should say, to think about what is the likelihood, and if not in aristocratic circles, where? Where were they, and how did they live? And what is the role of slavery and abolition? I always put those two things together because the abolitionist period is most active at the time that Austen is writing and her contemporaries are writing. Her contemporaries, who, by the way, are very explicit in many of their stories in writing about people of color and slavery.
Some years it seems you can't swing a dead cat, though, without hitting an Austen adaptation, and there are a few looming as we speak. A Netflix miniseries of Pride and Prejudice, and there's a new movie version of Sense and Sensibility. Why do you think she's still so popular, despite everything we've been saying, everything objectionable or not modern about her books? And you could list them: the heteronormativity and reactionary racial politics and elaborate social propriety and all the rest. I mean, I've read Pride and Prejudice I don't know how many times, so it's not like I'm not implicated in this, but I don't think I have an answer for it.
Well, two things. First, I just want to encourage everyone, because I think that there's a way that people feel, and I had to interrogate this, about how we're quote unquote, supposed to feel about Austen, right? I think that there's this sense that because she doesn't perform a politics that we now hold up as ideal, that we're not supposed to enjoy reading her. And I wouldn't want anybody to think that. I don't know that I would call Austen objectionable. And I don't know.
But I don't think we need this message, a woman needs to go out and find a man.
Right. I think
from
right.
ancient times.
Right. Exactly. And as I say, I think in one part of the introduction, either for this, there's no way in which Austen is radical. She's upholding a very conservative, patriarchal, heteronormative world. And just as a side note, for those reasons, I had complicated feelings about editing, because I thought, are these the texts that I want to uphold? Right? I've spent my career looking at underread novels and novelists who are underread in some part because they're talking about issues that England found inconvenient, not in its own time, but in the period that follows. It's the Victorians. Let's just blame them for sort of ignoring novels by women in particular. And with, the limited time I have, is this the best use of my time and energy? And I thought it was. Obviously, I said yes. I also felt like I could say in a way that was inviting and opening and engaging, let's look at Austen and think about not just slavery and abolition. In Northanger Abbey, for example, one of the short essays is about the servants in the novels that don't often have a voice. So that is, I don't know if it's a defense of Austen, but it is a sense that we can take her on her own terms. But I think it's fascinating that across cultures and across society, a lot of different kinds of people have picked up these stories and made them their own and done it really well. I think that Fire Island, for example, Pride, that queer adaptation that was, I think, on Hulu, is a really smart, vibrant, creative, engaging take on Austen that looks at queer culture. I think it's always a funny thing as somebody who doesn't want my students to be limited by things that they can quote unquote relate to. It doesn't necessarily have to be relatable for us to read it in class. But I think Austen is relatable to a lot of different kinds of people. I think it's very easy for Southern Black people to write stories about Austen or Austen-esque stories. Nikki Payne has written 2 Austen adaptations. creators keep going back because there's just so much that you can do with the framework that she offers, even, I think, in some ways, undermining it and making fun of it.
Well, it's interesting because I was thinking about why are we talking about Austen on our Shakespeare podcast? And I was thinking there's a lot of similarities between the two when you get down to it. Austen is taught pretty ubiquitously. I mean, we share this common knowledge of Jane Austen in the same way that we share a kind of globally a knowledge of Shakespeare's plays. And so it's this commonality that we have, and there's some very universal themes and maybe archetypal characters, and she exposes hypocrisy in a really enticing way, and there's sexiness and finding it. I mean, she encompasses a lot in her work in somewhat similar ways as Shakespeare. And I'm just curious what connections you see between them that help explain this enduring fascination or preoccupation with her.
You know what? I think you're right about all of that. And I think there's also something to be said about the comfort of generic expectations. I always say when I start my Austen class that just like you know that you're in a Shakespeare comedy because Shakespeare's comedies end in marriage, you understand that you're in a courtship novel because courtship novels end in marriage. And within the structures of genre, both Austen and Shakespeare have a lot of fun. And there's something comforting in understanding that the genre that you're in is going to produce a certain conclusion. And so you can and that's why we reread both of them. Once you understand what's going to happen, then you get to go back and really enjoy the way that these writers tell us that those things happen.
Yeah, I think what I look at, for instance, in Mansfield Park, it almost feels like a Shakespearean problem play ending, like All's Well to me.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that when Austen says at the end that she'll leave to other pens,
yes,
to explain, this, and what she's really saying is, I understand that I'm at the end, and there's a play, but we might remember The Lover's Vows in Mansfield Park, and at the end when she says, I'll leave it to other pens, it's almost as if she's saying, I understand that we have these generic expectations that we're supposed to work our way through. And I've done the work that I'm going to do with this story, and I've solved the problem, even though the solution might leave some of us wanting.
Well, one of the things we haven't talked about is Jane Austen's style, and she's been called strikingly modern in her writing technique. So can you talk more about that?
So one of the things that I do say in the introduction is that Austen's narrators don't just tell us the story. They don't just relate the events that happen. They actually have opinions about the characters that Austen introduces over the course of the novel and the way that people engage in the world. So we know that we're supposed to make fun of Mr. Collins because of the way the narrator describes him and the parts of him that we see in his speeches and in his letters. And that feels a little more modern than simply recounting the things that happen or the events that happen over the course of the story.
And that's a lot of the fun of reading Jane Austen, because she's so, I don't want to say snarky, but she's kind of snarky.
Yeah, her narrators certainly are. And I think that one of the reasons maybe for some people she comes across in some ways as more radical than she actually is because no one is spared from her critique.
Yeah, and you've been digging into Austen's life, too. I think it's fair to say that many people assume from her novels that her life was this sheltered one, provincial and quiet. How does that square with the facts, though?
I think through her reading especially, I think she was more widely read than anyone might originally think. And her brother writes this in the biographical notice that precedes Northanger Abbey. He says, that she lived a quiet life, but he's very proud and the family's very proud, both of how much she read, and how early she began writing and playing with history and stories about women and propriety. And so while she didn't travel a lot, she enjoyed the travel that she did engage in. She loved being in London, for example. And she was really an intellectually, and I think that's really important to understand, she was an intellectually curious reader who didn't just take everything in uncritically just because it was published in a book. And you see this a lot in Northanger Abbey. It's a novel about not just novel reading, which is what gets picked up the most because of its satirizing of Gothic fiction, but it is a novel about how children learn and what they learn through reading.
Oh, yeah, there are pages and pages of discourse between her and her love interest about the purpose of reading. In fact, it's a book about mansplaining, it seems to me.
Yes,
I mean,
I think that's
Tilney, the main character,
Tilney
is in love with, is such a mansplainer.
He really is, and is rather smug. I guess that's what mansplaining is at its core, right? It kind of smug,
right? Smug, declaiming.
But even her, and this goes back to the narrator not just telling the story. So, as you know, in Northanger Abbey, there's that very famous defense of the novel in the middle of telling the story.
Right, because at the time it was thought that, or some people thought that novels were mainly read by women and they were corrupting, right? That was the controversy.
Yes, and so the genre that England valorized was poetry, and particularly poetry by men. And novels were considered dangerous, mostly because they excited the imagination and encouraged fantasy. And it was not considered the best use of any person, but particularly a young woman's time. There's a great deal of anxiety about novel reading when Austen is writing. And even before, this is why Frances Burney, whose novel inspires the title of Pride and Prejudice, this is why for her first novel, she doesn't even call herself a novelist. She considers herself a quote-unquote editor who's editing the letters of a young woman that the young woman writes to her guardian. And so even the idea of the novel with chapters and characters that are very carefully delineated is something that was considered dangerous at a time when you really were supposed to be reading moral text or poetry.
I'm thinking Mark Twain famously hated Austen. Right. And he said a lot of kind of more violent things than this. But one of the things he said was that just the omission of her books alone would make a fairly good library out of a library that hadn't a book in it. But now that you've done so much work digging into the culture of her day and economy and the politics of the slave trade, does Austen's world irritate you less?
Oh, that's actually a good question. Does Austen's world irritate me less? I feel a little implicated in my attachment to some of Regency-era culture. And I think that the complicated relationship we have with Austen in that period is that there are parts of it that we like, that we have come to like. I think the reason that we have people who dress up like Austen characters or who care about what kind of punch was served or what happens at tea. I think that there is something very appealing in the way that so much of America is Anglophilic. Its love affair with England, we all woke up to watch Meghan Markle get married. And maybe this is what I'm getting towards, and I think a very legitimate critique of what Austen holds up in her novels. Patriarchal cultures, heteronormativity, ignoring the plight of the working class, ignoring the plight of enslaved people that she would have known about. I think at the same time, escapism is a real impulse. And I think I'm more sympathetic to that now than I was when I was a graduate student, for example, when it was very, very fashionable to dismiss Austen for all of the reasons that you say. I think we read her, or a lot of us read her with Said. Edward Said very famously talks about the dead silence in Mansfield Park. He gets some things wrong, but he still gets a lot right that we have to think about. In an essay that I wrote called Jane Austen and the Abolitionist Turn, I talk about a moment when I taught Austen in a class, a graduate seminar, and I watched the class split itself. So half of the women were middle-class white women who look exactly like you imagine an Austen fan would look. And the other half was, I teach at a diverse university, so they were queer, they were people of color, and the way that those two different groups read Austen was fascinating to me as an instructor. And one of them was asking the very questions you are, challenging the kind of world that she holds up as an ideal. And some, not all, but some of the white women thought of themselves as Elizabeth Bennet. And they were really not sure by the end of class what to do with their fascination with that world. And I think escapism is actually real and that our pleasures are always complicated. And so I'm perfectly fine understanding that part of that world feels appealing. You live in that for a little while, and then the real world is also right there.
It sounds like you did your job with that class. I am so glad you could take the time to talk today. Thank you. It's been a delight and so interesting.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. This is the first time I've processed doing these editions in real time, so I'm really grateful for the chance to think out loud about the work I tried to do.
That was Patricia Matthew, interviewed by Barbara Bogave. The Penguin Classics Deluxe editions of Pride and Prejudice and Northanger Abbey, edited and with introductions by Matthew, come out in September and are available for pre-order now. Her forthcoming edition of Mansfield Park on the Norton Library imprint is also available for pre-order and will publish early next year. This episode was produced by Matt Frasica. Garland Scott is the executive producer. It was edited by Gail Kern-Pastor. We had technical help from Digital Island Studios in New York and Voice Tracks West in Studio City, California. Our web producer is Paula Garcia Acuna. Leonor Fernandez edits our transcripts. Final mixing services provided by Clean Cuts at 3Cs Inc. If you're a fan of Shakespeare Unlimited, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. While you're there, be sure to hit follow so you get new episodes as soon as they come out. Shakespeare Unlimited comes to you from the Folger Shakespeare Library. Home to the world's largest Shakespeare collection, the Folger is dedicated to advancing knowledge and the arts. If you're in Washington, D.C., come visit the Folger on Capitol Hill. Come face-to-face with a Shakespeare First Folio in our exhibition halls, or take in a play in our theater. Or enjoy our Quill and Crumb Cafe. We'd love to see you. For more information, visit our website, folger.edu. Until next time, thanks for listening.